Chapter 11. The Effect of Stupidity on Humankind's Man-in-the-Moon Ambitions. In 1983, a Harvard psychologist named Howard Gardner published a book that caused a bit of a sensation. Its title was Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligences, and it described how human intelligence was too complex a concept to be defined in simplistic terms. People weren't just smart or stupid, Gardner argued. Brilliant musicians could be lousy at math, and Albert Einstein was probably a terrible basketball player. He may have been possessed of one of the finest analytical minds in the history of the human race, but it was housed in a body that could barely jump. Einstein had little to no physical intelligence. Those dopey examples are mine, not Gardner's, but you get the idea. A lot of people hated and still hate Gardner's theories, but when I read his book, I immediately embraced them. I like to think that I'm a reasonably intelligent person, but golly, I've done some incredibly boneheaded things during my time on planet Earth. Most of us have, I suppose, and most of our stupid mistakes are driven by our emotional states of mind. That's why we're called humans. In any event, I loved Gardner's theories because they provided me with the excuses I needed to explain away my incompetencies and my tendency to do stupid things, all while maintaining a positive sense of self-worth, safe in the knowledge that I'm not a complete idiot. As an example, in spite of my shortcomings, I know that I'm a reasonably good bullshitter because people tell me that I am, and thus some of them labor under the illusion that I'm smart. But I can't solve a Rubik's Cube to save my soul. Maybe it's because I'm lazy and impatient. But my troubles with the cube probably stem from the fact that I lack the proper spatial intelligence to solve it. Whenever I see a video of some dweeb solving a Rubik's Cube with his bare feet while sitting on a boogie board being towed by a boat, I get pissed off. Probably because I'm jealous. I at least take some consolation in Stephen Hawking's admission that he lacked spatial intelligence. He had enough trouble thinking in 3 dimensions, he once wrote, let alone the 4 or 10 or 11 dimensions that general relativity, superstring theory, or M-theory demanded. But in Hawking's case, I suspect that he was merely engaging in a bit of self-deprecating humor. Among those who howl and throw rocks at Gardner's ideas, the most off-cited reason is the lack of empirical evidence to support the multiple intelligences theory. That argument has always puzzled me because I've seen plenty of empirical evidence. Having spent years observing and researching my fellow humans, I've managed to see evidence of multiple intelligences, or the lack thereof, in almost everyone I've ever met. I have a friend, for example, who I'll just call the tinfoil hat man. I really like him. He's creative and innovative, and he's reasonably well-read. He seems quite intelligent, but his intelligence is degraded by the fact that he's a hopeless conspiracy theorist. The grassy knoll, the moon landings, 9/11, everything. He drives me nuts sometimes. Once upon a time, I did some moonlighting as a flight instructor, and I often used the death of JFK Jr. as a textbook example of what not to do in an airplane. I would use Kennedy's story to tell students about how a cascading series of bad decisions could lead to disaster. But the Hat Man had different ideas. On July 16, 1999, at around 8:40 in the evening, John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife Caroline, and his sister-in-law Lauren Bissett took off from Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey, bound for Martha's Vineyard. They were under pressure to get to their destination because Kennedy's cousin was getting married the next day. It was a Friday night, and most of the family had already assembled at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. Kennedy was flying an airplane that he'd only recently bought, a Piper Saratoga. To a layperson, the Piper might seem like a small plane, but to any general aviation pilot who's ever flown one, the Saratoga is big and powerful, and its systems are relatively complex. It's the kind of plane that's sometimes cynically referred to as a doctor killer, because it's expensive enough that only those with deep pockets can afford to buy one. Yet many of them don't have enough time to stay proficient in its use. Kennedy wanted to take off well before sunset. At 6 p.m., records would show, but his sister-in-law got stuck in heavy traffic while trying to reach the airport from Manhattan. Kennedy was also a little gimpy, having just had a cast removed from an ankle he'd broken in a hang-gliding accident. Lingering pain in his ankle may have made it a bit difficult for him to press the Saratoga's rudder pedals. In the air, after dusk, the sky grew hazy, and not long after departure, Kennedy was flying in the dark. He could have chosen a route that hugged the shoreline all the way to Martha's Vineyard, but instead he decided to fly directly to his destination, which was more than 30 miles away over open water. Any pilot can tell you that at dusk, the blue-gray haze of open water can easily blend into the blue-gray haze of the evening sky. The process is insidious until a pilot suddenly realizes that all visual cues have been lost. The horizon has disappeared, and with it the ability to visually ascertain what is up and what is not. With no horizon for reference, a pilot is forced to rely on the airplane's instruments. As mentioned in a previous chapter, when I made some dumb decisions and almost killed myself in an airplane, pilots have to learn to ignore the feelings in their butts and their inner ears, because a human body in motion will lie to them. It's easy for the centrifugal force of a shallow turn to fool pilots into thinking that they're flying upright when they're really not. As a shallow turn devolves into a steep turn, the illusion only grows more pronounced until the airplane spirals out of control. That is precisely what happened to JFK Jr., and that is why he and his passengers plunged to their deaths in a terrifying nosedive. The wise old flight instructor who taught me to be a flight instructor often told me that an aviation accident is most often caused by at least 3 major factors. When you get ready to fly, he'd say to me, start adding up the things about your intended flight that you don't like. And when you get to 2, you stop. You don't fly. You do something else. Because if that third thing that you don't like happens unexpectedly in the sky, there's a very good chance that you're going to die. Kennedy should have stopped as soon as he realized how late his sister-in-law's tardiness was going to push back their departure. Maybe he should have stopped even before then. But he didn't, and he and his passengers paid the ultimate price for his bad decisions. The same thing almost happened to me, but I was lucky. Poor JFK Jr. was not. Neither was Kobe Bryant. Once, when I recounted the sad tale of JFK Jr.'s demise to a student pilot, my friend the Hat Man was sitting nearby. When I finished, the Hat Man said to us, "Well, you know, that's not really what happened." "Really?" I countered. "Because what I just told this guy is pretty much straight out of the NTSB accident report." "So why don't you tell us what really happened?" I challenged my friend. His response floored me. Bill and Hillary had him killed because they were afraid he was going to steal her Senate seat. Oi. It isn't often that I find myself at a loss for words, but the nuttiness of my friend the Hat Man's answer left me speechless. Maybe his conspiracy theory tendencies were a result of some shortcomings in his logical mathematical intelligence. Maybe it was a failure of his interpersonal intelligence. Maybe it was a combination of both. But clearly there were some wiring errors in his otherwise fine mind that degraded his ability to be smart. During my years of careful research, I also managed to discover the human antiparticle to my friend the Hat Man. She came in the form of a young au pair from France. Our buddies Guillaume and Laura had hired her to look after their 2 young children. The au pair was 19 years old when she first landed in the USA. She came from the suburbs of Paris, and she was as sweet and as kind and as gentle a person as one could ever meet. She was also perhaps the most appallingly ignorant person I've ever met. She dropped out of school at 16, the minimum legal age to do so in France, and almost immediately during my early interactions with her, it became painfully obvious that she knew next to nothing about anything. Anything, at least, that existed in my world. Being the generous people that they are, Guillaume and Laura bought a plane ticket for the au pair to go visit New York City during one of her first free weekends. The au pair was to have traveled with a couple of friends, but she screwed up the dates when she booked her ticket, and she ended up having to travel alone to New York. Nevertheless, she had a great time, and when she returned, I asked her what she'd seen. Her answers were predictable. Times Square, the Empire State Building, Central Park. I asked her if, when she visited Central Park, she'd seen the Strawberry Fields Memorial to John Lennon. "Strawberry Fields?" she asked quizzically. "Oui," I said in terrible French. "You know, the memorial to John Lennon." What came next floored me as much as the Hat Man's theories about JFK Jr.'s demise. "John Lennon?" the au pair asked. I was stunned. The Beatles?" I asked again, still hopeful that she wasn't going to tell me that she'd never heard of the Beatles. But she'd never heard of the Beatles. I couldn't give up. Yesterday, love was such an easy game to play. Na 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 na. Hey Jude, we all live in a yellow submarine? Nope, nothing. I should have known better. Earlier, on the au pair's very first free weekend, she'd decided to take a Greyhound bus from Louisville to Chicago. Naturally, to save money, she'd also decided to book her bus ticket for the least expensive departure at 3 a.m. When we asked her how she planned to get to the bus station at that ungodly hour, she told us that she was going to ride there on an electric scooter. Double oi. "No," I told her, "you're not going to ride an electric scooter to the bus station at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm an old man. I get up a lot in the middle of the night anyway. I'll take you there." She was ever so grateful. So were Guillaume and Laura, who of course worried like I did that something terrible might happen to the au pair if she tried to venture to the bus station on her own. Naturally, one of them could have taken her, but they were real people with real lives, and they needed their sleep. I wasn't, and I didn't. Back then, the Louisville Greyhound bus terminal sat at the intersection of 7th Street and Muhammad Ali Boulevard, and it was only about a 15-minute drive from Guillaume and Laura's house, which was only a couple of blocks from our house, and from Mitch McConnell's house. During our short commute, I did my best to put the fear of an American God into the poor au pair. In my shitty French, I told her that the United States ain't France. Chicago ain't Paris. Chicago may be the most dangerous big city in the U.S., I said to her. They have lots of guns there. They shoot each other. A lot. There's gun violence everywhere. And not just in the bad neighborhoods, I told her. It's everywhere. Everything that I said just bounced off of her. The car radio was set to WFPK, of course. WFPK is the flagship station of Louisville Public Media, a partnership of stations that's the envy of public radio stations all around the U.S. I've been lucky enough to listen to a lot of radio in a lot of cities all over the world, and I've never heard a better collection of stations than that of Louisville's public radio. There's WFPL, which carries NPR talk radio. There's WUOL, formerly the station of the University of Louisville, founded in 1798, which plays classical music. And there's WFPK, which plays mostly contemporary music, but they play a little of everything. Jazz, country, bluegrass, everything. I've learned a hell of a lot about music by listening to WFPK. I've learned a hell of a lot about a lot of things by listening to the stations of Louisville Public Media. At 2:30 in the morning, WFPK was playing a Prince mixtape from his Hits 2 album. "You like Prince?" I asked the au pair. She just grunted. "What kind of music do you listen to?" I asked again. "Hop," she said in French, so that it sounded like up. "Seulement up française." Only French hip-hop. That answer made me sigh. I understood then that I really was growing old, and that the world I knew was growing old with me, and that the young au pair from France lived in a very different world than the one I was accustomed to. At the bus terminal, I scanned the crowd for weirdos, but there were only a bunch of sad bus people there. I continued my lecture to the au pair. "Take this piece of paper," I told her. "There's $20 wrapped inside it. I printed all of our phone numbers on it. Keep it in your shoe," I said. "If you get ripped off and lose your phone, you'll at least be able to get someone to contact us. And if someone points a gun at you, don't say anything. Just give them your stuff." She just smiled. There were 2 buses sitting in the terminal that night. Next to the one bound for Chicago, another bus had Cleveland displayed in its front window. The au pair looked at the Cleveland bus and tried to pronounce the name of its destination. "Cleveland," she guessed. I tried to correct her. "Is it a big city?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "it's a very big city." Then I dialed up Google Maps on my phone to show her where it was. And then I showed her where Chicago was. "This is where we are, and this is where you're going," I told her. "Ah, okay," she said, and then she smiled. I got the impression that I'd just given her her very first geography lesson. Her reaction left me a bit dismayed, but then I thought about my own lack of geographic knowledge. There are probably at least a dozen cities in China with a population of 10 million or more that I've never heard of, I figured. But it still bugged me that she'd never heard of Cleveland. When the bus driver made the call for Chicago, a sad little line formed in front of the door. I stood with the au pair while the driver scanned the passengers' barcoded tickets on their phones. Ahead of us, a hunched-over old woman wearing a COVID mask on her chin started scrolling through her phone. No ticket. "What's your name?" the driver asked, and she mumbled an inaudible response. He went out to the bus to check his passenger manifest. When he came back, he told her that her name wasn't on it. "You'll have to go to the counter," he told her, and he motioned in its direction. The sad little woman shuffled away. After the au pair got on the bus, I looked over to the counter to see if the woman needed any help. I'd bought a bus ticket or 2 for friends in the past, I reasoned, so maybe I could help this old woman out if she needed me to. But when I looked over at the counter, no one was there. The sad little woman was gone. At least the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Later, I traded notes with Guillaume and Laura about our hand-wringing over the au pair's trips. Things always worked out fine, of course, and she always had a great time. Maybe we were too old, I told them, and too guilty of overthinking and over-worrying, especially me. Maybe the au pair knew better than we did. And maybe what she was trying to tell us in the language of her clueless youth was, "Fuck it, I'm just gonna live." She'd screwed up her plane tickets. She'd never heard of the Beatles or Cleveland. Yet she was somehow smarter than we were. She possessed the kind of street smarts that we can only dream of having. Maybe she knew a lot more about how to live than we did. Of course, ignorance and stupidity aren't the same thing, although they can manifest themselves in outwardly similar behaviors. And ignorance can be sometimes cured, can't it, whereas a lack of intelligence generally cannot. Not without a little help from ChatGPT, anyway. But ignorance bonded with stupidity, like a couple of quarks bound by the strong force, can be very hard to tell apart. And the combination can be damned dangerous, and sometimes it can be downright evil. As human antiparticles, the tinfoil hat man and the au pair would probably annihilate one another if they ever came into contact, but other than that, I deem his conspiracy quirkiness and her general cluelessness to be relatively harmless. The hat man isn't the type to spread conspiracy theories online. I think that he mostly gets a kick out of being contrarian. And both he and the au pair are kind, gentle people, and I know that neither of them could ever hurt a flea. The same cannot be said, however, of conspiracy theorists who become so contorted in their thinking that they commit acts of violence, beating up protesters at a political rally, attacking the U.S. Capitol because some other idiot convinced them that an election had been stolen, shooting up a pizza parlor because they think that a pedophile ring is being run there. That, of course, is exactly what happened in 2016 when a moron from North Carolina drove to Washington, D.C. to cause some bad trouble. He wanted to investigate claims that Hillary Clinton was running a child abuse ring in the basement of a popular D.C. pizza joint called Comet Ping Pong. The idiot blasted the lock off the restaurant's storage closet with an assault rifle, because of course he had an assault rifle, and in so doing he scared the living daylights out of a bunch of kids who were there to, what else, eat pizza and play ping pong. Of course there were no child sex slaves in the basement. There wasn't even a basement. It's a miracle that no one was physically hurt. Later, future Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson sentenced the now remorseful moron to 4 years in prison. She should have sentenced him to life. Dangerous idiots don't belong on our streets, especially dangerous idiots who own assault rifles. In an earlier chapter, I blithely called Donald Trump an imbecile. I also referred to his devotees as morons. If I want to apply the principles of Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences to Trump and his followers, I'm forced to admit that my assessments of him and of them are too facile. Linguistically, Donald Trump has to be the dumbest person ever to inhabit the White House. His limited vocabulary and his broken record use of hackneyed, hyperbolic phrases are dead giveaways. And yet he clearly possesses some kind of interpersonal intelligence that allows him to energize his followers, albeit followers whose linguistic and analytical skills are probably even more limited than his. But among those followers there are probably some amazing musicians, and artists who can paint like Norman Rockwell, and even a few who can solve a Rubik's Cube with their bare feet while riding on a boogie board. But if they really believe that Donald Trump is a talented messiah who's come to make America great again, then they're obviously unable to solve the Rubik's Cube that is politics. They lack political intelligence. They are politically stupid. Or they're at least politically ignorant. Or maybe they're both. During my own political career, such as it was, I met plenty of politically stupid people of all stripes. A prime example among liberals was Professor Adjunct, who wasted everyone's time by talking about whites and Indians when he should have been addressing real-world concerns about the control of a known carcinogen. I spent far more time with liberals than with conservatives, of course, but there's no getting around the fact that I met far more politically stupid conservatives than politically stupid liberals. And my observations jibe with those of others, and they have throughout history. In 1861, a British member of Parliament named John Stuart Mill published a book titled Considerations on Representative Government. The internets are full of claims that in his book Mill wrote, "I never meant to say that conservatives are generally stupid. I meant to say that stupid people are generally conservative." The problem is there's no record that Mill ever wrote anything like that. But what he did say in an 1866 speech was this: "What I stated was that the Conservative Party was, by the law of its constitution, necessarily the stupidest party." Laughter. Now, I do not retract this assertion, but I did not mean that conservatives are generally stupid. I meant that stupid persons are generally conservative. Laughter and cheers. I believe that to be so obvious and undeniable a fact that I hardly think that any honorable gentleman will question it. But there is a dense, solid force in sheer stupidity, such that a few able men, with that force pressing behind them, are assured of victory in many a struggle. and many a victory the Conservative Party have owed to that force. The quote comes from a collection of Mill's speeches on a website called the Online Library of Liberty. What Mills seemed to be telling us is that politically intelligent conservatives are more successful than liberals at manipulating the politically stupid in order to further their goals. That, of course, is exactly what we saw happen on that awful day in Washington, D.C. in January of 2021. It goes without saying that everyone who breached the Capitol and everyone who committed an act of violence that day was politically stupid. And everyone who actually believed that the 2020 presidential election was rigged was, at the very least, politically ignorant. In fact, when the guy who carried the Confederate flag into the Capitol was on trial, his lawyer even used the defense that his client was lacking even average intellectual capacity. When he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, the poor guy wrote a sincere statement of contrition. "I offer my sincerest apology to the country, its school children, and everyone who saw the worst of me and everyone on January 6th, he said. What he wrote next made me terribly sad. "I lost my son and I lost my wife. I made a terrible mistake, and my family has suffered because of it. When I was studying to be a flight instructor, one of the course lessons I had to complete was called Fundamentals of Instruction. In the lesson text was this sentence: "One definition of learning is behavior modification brought about as the result of experience." When I read that, I had to admit to myself that I've apparently never learned a damned thing because I keep making the same stupid mistakes over and over again. But I found hope in the words of Confederate flagman. He may not really have been politically stupid when he entered the Capitol on January 6th. Maybe he was just politically ignorant. And maybe the shock therapy of jail time and the loss of his family will help him to dispel his ignorance. Naturally, not everyone who supports a guy like Donald Trump is politically stupid. By his own autobiographical admission, Mitch McConnell was academically inferior to his former schoolmate and my friend Terry McCoy, but during his long career, Mitch has nevertheless proven that he's something of a political genius. If he wasn't, he could never have accomplished the things that he did. In the aftermath of January 6th, for a few brief moments it even seemed as though Mitch had a conscience and that he was as incensed at Donald Trump's actions as the rest of us were. But the Grim Reaper quickly came to his political senses. He had, after all, just spent 4 years grooming and manipulating the useful idiot-in-chief to do his bidding, and he'd been spectacularly successful in doing so. He'd built the Supreme Court that he always dreamed about. He'd worked to gut social and environmental programs. He'd blocked or blunted all attempts at real gun control measures, even in the wake of Uvalde. Like Vladimir Putin, Mitch was not about to throw a valuable asset like Donald Trump under the bus. The dense, solid force of sheer political stupidity that's an intrinsic part of every Donald devotee was too powerful a weapon for a guy like Mitch to ever abandon. The Grim Reaper set aside his reservations about the Donald's horrible behaviors, and he did what he always does. He deftly put his own self-interest and the interests of conservative causes ahead of the country's interests. Even though he loves to talk about the American people and what they want, the only thing that really matters to Mitch is what Mitch wants. And that's because, as my old friend Terry often told me, Mitch has been a mean, nasty, self-serving son of a bitch ever since he was a little kid. Perhaps the human antiparticle to Mitch McConnell is the one and only Stuart Rhodes, who of course became infamous for his oath-keeper role in the January 6th insurrection. Rhodes was academically bright enough to obtain a law degree from Yale, yet he was politically dumb enough to think that organizing a mob to storm the U.S. Capitol was a good idea. He was also dumb enough to think that keeping a gun in his house for protection made him safer. On both counts, he paid a heavy price. With his own gun, he managed to shoot out one of his eyeballs, and in 2023 he was sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role in the attack on the Capitol. Mr. Oathkeeper is going to have lots of time to reflect on the consequences of his political stupidity. Or if he is in fact merely politically ignorant, he's certainly going to have a lot of time to properly educate himself. When she retired as anchor of the PBS NewsHour in December of 2022, the great Judy Woodruff embarked on a special assignment to travel America. One of her main objectives was to analyze the political divide that increasingly disturbs all of us and to examine efforts to bridge that divide. In one segment, she highlighted a British program where a conservative, transgender-hating man was paired with a transgender woman to work together on a project to build a bar. Neither of them knew the background of the other. While engaged in the project, the two bonded and became real friends. When the transgender status of his newfound friend was revealed to the conservative, he was given the option of walking away or drinking a beer with his friend. He chose to drink the beer, which of course made the program's viewers, as well as its sponsor Heineken, very happy. But the lesson was still a good one. Sometimes it is possible for the politically stupid, or at least the politically ignorant, to be enlightened. Perhaps, with enough effort, they can obtain a measure of political intelligence. The problem is that doing so takes a lot of time, and time is something we no longer have. When John Stuart Mill gave his speech in 1866, he could never have imagined how radically different our world would be from his. The dense, solid force of sheer stupidity in the Internet age has created an existential crisis for democracies around the planet. It killed a lot of people during the COVID crisis, and it will do so again when the next pandemic hits. It made too many British voters think that Brexit was a good idea, and now they're beset by economic problems. It fooled enough desperate or disaffected American voters in a few key swing states to either leave their ballots blank or to vote for an incompetent cretin like Donald Trump. Around the world, technology-driven stupidity has fueled an exponential rise in nationalism that would astonish a guy like Mill. It's also created a real mortal danger for democracies everywhere. I saw it when I attended the Trump rally in 2016. We all saw it on January 6, 2021. And technology ensures that stupidity and ignorance will continue to pose an existential threat. Even after the moron from North Carolina made a fool of himself by shooting up Comet Ping Pong, legions of other online morons still claim that Hillary Clinton is doing horrible things to children in the D.C. restaurant's non-existent basement. If our democracy really is in danger of being destroyed, it's mostly because the weight of technology-driven stupidity is threatening to crush it. In 1866, the population of planet Earth was around 1.5 billion. Now it's 8 billion and still climbing. Half of those 8 billion live in relative affluence, while the other half live in abject poverty. The affluent half are gobbling up Earth's resources at more than twice the rate that our poor old planet can replenish them. The impoverished half see all of that, and they're desperately clamoring to migrate where the affluent half live. Can we blame them? At the same time, the affluent half have become so adept at burning things that we are in real danger of turning our beautiful planet, as Stephen Hawking fearfully told the BBC, into another Venus. If I manage to roam the Earth for just a few more years, the population of our planet will have tripled in my lifetime. Plastics that didn't exist when I was born are now filling our oceans and our bloodstreams. And those who want to shrink government down to a size so small that it can be drowned in a bathtub are going to drown along with it unless we implement some real climate crisis solutions in a hurry. Our world is exponentially different than Mill's. It's exponentially different than the world I was born into. Maybe Thomas Jefferson and his contemporaries could afford to be patient, but we can't. We don't have a lot of time left to dispel the reign of witches that Jefferson complained about in his letter to a friend all those years ago. The politically stupid and the politically ignorant have always been with us and always will be, of course, but we can no longer afford to let them run the show. We can't let their enablers run the show either. As I mentioned earlier in this book, whenever Mitch McConnell is confronted with the subject of climate change, he just drawls, "I'm not a scientist." His glib answer belies the fact that he knows better. These days, he'll even occasionally admit that climate change is a problem, but then, with a Kentucky chuckle, he'll say that he doesn't know what to do about it. Well, Mitch, we damn well better elect officials who do know what to do about it, and we damn well better do it soon. When I studied engineering as a kid, I learned to trust the power of real data. A preponderance of real data now tells me that only big, well-run governments can solve the existential crises that we face, and only we can create and empower those governments to do so. We're going to have to vote for candidates who tell us things that we don't want to hear. We're going to have to circumvent the power of big money influences to elect candidates who have our best interests at heart, not theirs. And once we elect those candidates, we're going to have to work with them to make sacrifices that we don't want to make. There is no other way. In 1964, a guy named Paul Zindel wrote a play called The Effect of Gamma Rays on Man-in-the-Moon Marigolds. In the play, a cerebral young girl attempts to measure the effects of radiation on some marigolds that she's raised herself. She's conducting her experiments for a school science fair, but her efforts are hindered by her dysfunctional mother and her sister. Realizing that she's a failure and intellectually inferior to her cerebral daughter, out of sheer jealousy, the mother constantly tries to ruin her daughter's chances of winning a prize at the science fair. The cerebral girl's erratic sister follows their mother's lead. During the years that I was involved with politics, I saw the same behaviors evolve in the modern Republican Party. Donald Trump and his enablers are the dysfunctional mother. His followers and their gun-toting Sieg Heil tendencies are the erratic sister. Educated liberal elites are the cerebral sister, and their attempts to protect an advanced civilization are constantly being thwarted by jealous idiots. And if we're not careful, the dense, solid forces of their sheer stupidity will kill us. The one and only James Carville is on record as saying, in his uniquely Cajun Carvillian way, that the problem the Republican Party has is they got really stupid people that vote in their primaries. And really stupid people demand to have really stupid leaders. That's where the Republican Party is now. Maybe we should temper Carville's use of the word stupid by replacing it with the phrase politically stupid, but of course he has a point. When JFK visited Louisville in 1962, one of his best friends was the Kentucky Republican Senator John Sherman Cooper. There are still a few John Sherman Coopers left in the Republican Party, but they get voted out of office or booed off a stage if ever they dare to cross Donald Trump. Because of that, most politically intelligent Republicans are too chicken to call out the emperor for not wearing any clothes. We all wish that they would, but as long as the Donald is around, they never will. They may be politically intelligent, but they're not politically brave. The modern Republican Party has gone mad. The forces of stupidity that they've managed to harness have manifested themselves in acts of violence and oppression. The Republican Party has allowed itself to become evil. I caught a glimpse of that evil in the grin of a lowly Republican Party staffer when he and I spoke to college Republicans in 2006. I heard it in the words of a beady-eyed man in 2008 while I was stumping for Barack Obama in Columbus, Ohio. I saw it in the face of a fat guy who taunted us with an assault rifle while we were protesting gun violence in 2015. I saw it again at a Trump rally in 2016. And of course we all saw it during the horrific events of January 6, 2021. Now we see it in everyone who dismisses or defends the actions of those who sought and still seek to subvert the will of the American people. It's madness. There can be no compromise with that kind of evil. We simply have to beat it. All the indictments and all the convictions in the world won't really solve our problems. They can only treat the symptoms of our illness, not the disease. We have only one real weapon at our disposal that we can use to defeat political stupidity, and that, of course, is our vote. Maybe George Carlin was right when he said that the average person is stupid, but the average voter is not. The average American voter preferred Al Gore over George W. Bush, and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden over Donald Trump. The average voter supports universal health care, reproductive rights for women, equal rights for minorities, LGBTQ and transgender people, sensible gun control legislation, and perhaps most important of all, responsible action to fight the effects of climate change. But the average voter has to vote, in every election and in every race, from dog catcher to the person who will occupy the White House. But all too often the average voter does not vote, in part because the enablers of the politically stupid do everything they can to keep us from leveling the playing field and to keep the politically intelligent away from the polls. Gerrymandering, preservation of the stupid electoral college, voter suppression. And beyond those measures, there are also the twin enemies of democracy called apathy and ignorance, which keep too many voters away from the polls too much of the time, and which keeps them ignorant of the candidates they're expected to elect. Do you know who any of these judges are? Is a question that I still hear over and over. We have to change all of that, in a hurry. And perhaps the only way to do so, as Michael Moore suggested, is to bring the polls to the voters. We have to make it much easier for the politically intelligent to vote. We have to create a system that makes politically intelligent people want to vote, and vote, and vote, and vote.